All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first lecture of our this year's annual seminar, which is called Engagement and Domination. As you all remember, last year we had an annual seminar on violence and critique, featuring various prominent lecturers from around the world, and this year we are continuing this relatively young tradition. We are going to explore two, in our view, fundamental concepts and their interimbrication. So let me just briefly introduce the seminar, and then I'll introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Matthias Bormuth. Engagement is often used as a term synonymous with political protest, new social movements, or civic activism. But at the same time, engagement can be conceptualized as one fundamental type of human action, even as the most basic mode of human existence, as in some phenomenological traditions of conceiving human existence as engagement with the world. So the fruitfulness of the concept of engagement lies in this potential to bridge different levels of abstraction in our reflection on social reality. From social ontology and philosophical anthropology to social movement studies and the analysis of novel forms of political action, and thus the concept of engagement transcends disciplinary boundaries. Any reflection on engagement seems to inherently press us toward developing a holistic perspective on contemporary social reality, one that simultaneously addresses questions like what type of action does the term engagement refer to, how is collective engagement possible in light of the irreducible idiosyncrasy of individuals, etc. But then at every level of reflection on the phenomenon of engagement, we also encounter what might be termed the conceptual mirror image of this term in terms of complexity and analytical potential, namely the concept of domination. So while engagement is used as equated with civic activism or political protest, domination frequently becomes the synonym for oppression, exploitation, or the existence of societal inequalities. But this concept also has a potential to bridge different levels of abstraction and spark a holistic reflection on social reality. For example, the rich tradition of critical theory testifies to the analytical potential of domination. From Horkheimer, Adorno, and Benjamin to Habermas, Honneth, and Judith Butler, critical theorists have theorized domination as both a systemic property of social reality and a fundamental aspect of the human condition. So in these perspectives, domination bridges the gap between the macro level of power symmetries and the micro level of human subjectivity. Since domination, understood most broadly as the repression of one or other form of human potentiality, plays a constitutive role in the process of self-formation. And in this year's annual seminar, we aim to explore the conceptual and empirical interimbrication of engagement and domination. Making use of this analytical potential of these two concepts, we would like to address questions like the following. Can domination be fruitfully conceptualized as neutralization of engagement, of the human capacity for reflecting on the existing norms and rules of social action? Can there be collective engagement without one or another form of domination that is constitutive for the very collective that is engaged? Could the thoroughly non-authoritarian engagement still successfully challenge and dismantle the most complex forms of domination in contemporary capitalism, such as those that require some form of diagnosis or uncovering, and thus also a degree of epistemological privilege on the part of the engaged collective? And are we today witnessing what might be called complex regimes of domination, in Luke Boltanski's terms, where the very reproduction of domination unfolds in the form of constant invitation to actors to get engaged? So these would be the questions that we wish to address in this year's annual seminar. And our guest, Professor Matthias Bormuth, perfectly fits into this conception. His lecture today bears the title Ambivalence and Engagement, Max Weber's idea of plurality in a disenchanted world. Professor Bormuth holds the chair of comparative intellectual history at Oldenburg University in Germany. He also runs the Karl Jaspers House with a weekly program in the variety of the humanities. Next to his other publications in the field of intellectual history, he published and edited books on Hannah Arendt, Erich Auerbach, Karl Jaspers, and Max Weber. His books are published by the German publishing houses Berenberg, Fromm und Holzbug, Mattes und Seitz, Springer und Wallstein. Before he came to Oldenburg, he taught at European and American universities, at Columbia University, Tübingen, and Heidelberg University. And in today's lecture, Professor Bormuth will address Max Weber's idea of the disenchantment of the world. Max Weber is well known as one of the founding fathers of modern sociology, and his topos of the disenchantment of the world is well known as a diagnostic tool to understand the challenge of a pluralistic society with its personal and collective ambivalences. How can, under these circumstances, social engagement be possible? Why were different intellectuals like Jaspers and Lukács attracted by Weber's idea of modern plurality? The question what role sciences could take in order to encounter this challenge was answered by Weber in his famous speech, Science as a Vocation. And I wouldn't like to take any more time from Professor Bormuth, so I will just
I like to listen to you. It's perfect.
Give him the word. Thank you, Professor Bormuth.
Thank you for having me here. I think I will talk about an hour. And it's a great privilege to be here. It's the first time in Belgrade for me. I was here as a young student, still in Yugoslavia at that time at the shore. So it's my second time here in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, in Belgrade the first time. And talking about Max Weber is not easy with philosophers because normally he's taken as a social theorist. But my experience with Weber is he's also an implicit philosopher. And if this talk could help you to understand why Weber could be seen as a philosopher, it would be great. I have a first small point, my way to Weber. Then there will be 4 main points why Weber is necessary or matters, the intellectual, the becoming of Weber, and then the core science as a vocation in the center of my talk. And at the end, the ambivalence of plurality, the case of Karl Jaspers and Georg Lukács, explaining the idea of plurality of Max Weber and 2 opposite reactions to it. So I start with my short remarks on my way to Max Weber. I started out as a psychiatrist and worked on Karl Jaspers and psychoanalysis. And therefore I had to read Max Weber. I never just heard the name before. And I was struck how important and clear his thoughts were, even to understand Jaspers and to be critical on Jaspers. This was about 20 years ago. I was really impressed by him and said, okay, I can understand Jaspers with Weber and be critical on Jaspers. And at that time I knew that although Jaspers was saying, Max Weber is my great hero, intellectual hero, there was a certain difference between them. And the difference, as I can say now, is somehow connected to Weber's idea of plurality. So when I talk today about plurality in Max Weber, it's somehow showing why Jaspers and Weber are different in a certain philosophical way. This is my attempt today to show why the idea of plurality in Max Weber, which I think is enormously important for our understanding of modernity, is different from Jaspers, and why it's worthwhile to read Max Weber as a theorist of philosophy, of moral sciences, if you want to, of social sciences. This was my short first point. I never stopped reading Max Weber, and the point is, I think classical authors could be read every year. Yeah. Good authors are always interesting, and the point why they're interesting is they do not solve problems, they clear up problems. This is, I think, the most important thing. If you have something very worthwhile to read, it's not because of the solution in philosophy, it's because of the ability to clear up a problem which is always interesting and important for us. And Weber somehow is a person who had a nose for problems and terms to express them, and not solving the problems. So engagement in Weber means clearing up problems, not solving them. So everybody who is expecting someone who solves problems is not the right one to read Max Weber. But I think as philosophers, since we all love problems, it's great to read him. And there are too many philosophers who try to solve problems, and not too many who are open up to say, I know this, and this I don't know. And Weber is someone who is very clear in the ability to say where the limits of our knowledge are. And this is somehow a great point. And if I'm asked why Weber matters, I would always say because he has a great idea of what an intellectual is. And normally we say an intellectual is a person who's enlightened, who's able to argue with some rationality. This is somehow an intellectual. And this is true, and this is somehow the fundament of being an intellectual, to be able to clarify things, to argue, to use your reason for thinking. But the important point in Weber was about 1900 that he took the French term of being an intellectual and explained it with the German tradition, with the tradition of Kant and Hegel. So for him, an intellectual was not just a person who was able to use his rationality to have in this way reason, but for Weber, reason was also, as he was saying, the inner need of having the world and the cosmos as a whole and seeing it as a whole, which has a certain meaning. And this idea of seeing and explaining and understanding the cosmos as a whole with a certain meaning is something typical for the German idealistic tradition. And Weber is somehow a person who was raised in this tradition, who liked this tradition, but who didn't share anymore the answers of this tradition. So when he thinks and reads of an intellectual, he is somehow taking this perspective without the old answers. But he's still looking in this horizon of an idealistic question, what is the meaning of the whole? And also we are not able to answer this question. It is still important for us to see things in this broader horizon. And whenever you read Weber, you have to have this in mind, that his thinking is not just to clear up things in order how we can live pragmatically together, but also how we can give meaning to our lives. And this is a purely philosophical question. And therefore it's very interesting that Karl Jaspers, who was living in the Heidelberg of Max Weber, was the first one to call him an existential philosopher in 1920 when Weber died. So 1920, Weber was at that age 56, it was too early to die. He was giving a speech to the students in Heidelberg, Karl Jaspers, and saying Max Weber was a sociologist, but at the most he was a philosopher. And all his colleagues were saying, is Jaspers wrong? But the interesting thing is that he saw the implicit philosophy in Max Weber. And all I try to do today is somehow to give an apology of Weber as a philosopher today. Why it's worthwhile to read him, even if you're a philosopher. And this ability and this need, like this inner need, which Weber talks about, of bringing some meaning into life as an intellectual, is a great privilege. Something people who are just able to fulfill an outer need, to have their daily bread and things, which see as something very special, they normally don't have time for. And we as intellectuals have a great privilege in thinking about the meaning of life. Normally when you're in academic life, we don't think about it anymore. But I think compared to other people who have other works to do, we as people who have spare time to think about the meaning of life are very privileged. And it's our task somehow to give this privilege back to the people in telling them how their and our life could be meaningful. And therefore Weber was quite clear that we have to use this privilege to inform our society, to enlighten them with the idea of the problems we have of their lives and our lives. And when Weber was talking about the meaningfulness of life, he was clear that this question is not a question which is a question for scientists, not just a question for philosophers. It's also a question of arts, of literature, of other arts. So it's very interesting to see that he in Heidelberg was one of the first academics who was very open to the bohemian people in his time, to the artists, to the writers, those who are somehow asking those questions too in a different way. So for Weber was the trespassing of disciplines very important. I will come back to this point later. And he had around himself a certain circle of people from different branches of sciences and different branches of the arts. So asking about the meaning of society, the meaning of personal life, was always taking the perspectives of arts into the account also. And maybe you know some people of the Weber circle next to Karl Jaspers or Georg, Lukács, Friedrich Gundolf, Stefan Georg, Otto Kross, Ernst Toller, German writers who were very fascinated by Weber. And if you see the academic life of that time in Germany, it wasn't normal that those academic professors opened up for the Bohemian people. And so you can say the sociologist Max Weber was one of the first ones in the academic life in Germany to open up for those perspectives too, and to discuss with those people the questions of meaning in life. In my talk, I want to follow three questions which could be raised with Max Weber. What is science? What is the world? What is man? Great questions, big questions. And I'm very happy that this talk, Science as a Vocation, which Weber gave in 1917 at the end of First World War, is a talk where all those questions are touched, not solved. And therefore I will try to give you some ideas what Weber understood, how science can function, what science is, what the world is about, and what we are about. And to answer those questions with a talk of science as a vocation, I first want to give some remarks on the becoming of Max Weber. And this is not by accident, because I think every thinker has somehow intellectual history of his becoming, and this becoming is very important to understand his thoughts. The becoming doesn't explain his thoughts, but it's important as the background out of which a person thinks. And therefore I think it's worthwhile to know at least a little bit how Max Weber became the person he was in Germany. He was born in 1864 and he studied law, and then he had in a very early age a professorship for national economics. It's about 32, 33 years, was a prestigious chair in Freiburg, and everybody was thinking this is our great academic hope, Max Weber. He's doing a great job there in Freiburg, and he really did, and he worked until he was exhausted and moved to Heidelberg University just some years later in 1897. And then about 1 or 2 years after he had started working there in Heidelberg, he had a serious breakdown. Psychiatric disorder, somehow he wasn't able to concentrate anymore, to sleep anymore, to work anymore. And there are now in Germany about 2 or 3 biographies on Max Weber with great big chapters on his illness. And at that time the people could say, yes, somehow nervous breakdown, melancholic passages, anxiety, nervousness, but at the end, whatever you call it, Max Weber wasn't able to work anymore. And there's a legend that he was playing with toys only, not reading any book anymore. And if you look closer to it, you can see that somehow the idea is not far away to saying maybe Max Weber was fleeing into illness, maybe taking illness as a possibility of getting out of the academic world. Because in 1902, after 2 or 3 years of the serious illness, he decided to leave university, and his wife was terrified. Yeah? No academic role anymore. What should happen to my husband? Yeah? So the worst case, not being important in academic life anymore, happened to Max Weber. And it's very interesting to see that afterwards, as a private person, a real private scholar, you could say, with a small pension, he started working even more in a very open way. And his wife, who was first terrified by this decision, then started to build up a circle around Max Weber. And this circle was built up, as I said, by scholars from different branches and by artists. So you could say Max Weber had a center of advanced study privately at his home. Every Sunday he met those people, was free to work. So I could recommend become sick and then you have time to work. No, I'm just joking. But anyhow, you can see, and you have people like William James, like Abi Warburg, even Karl Jaspers or Friedrich Nietzsche, who somehow had certain shorter or longer times of being sick, and somehow taking this being at the edge of the society and being at the edge of the, we say in German, akademischen Betrieb, academic business, helped them to really work. And everybody who knows the academic lives, how useful it could be to be at the margin, to be at the edge for a certain time, to have time to read and think. And therefore you could say, whether Max Weber knew about it or not, that this serious illness was very important for him to develop his thinking between all disciplines. Because normally, if you are part of a discipline, you know there's a certain order, as the word discipline says. You have to have a profile, you have to have certain questions, you have to follow those questions. But the point is, serious problems are between the disciplines. And if you want to follow a problem, you sometimes have to trespass. And academic people don't like trespassing. So it's very hard to follow a serious problem if you're part of a society or discipline who is saying, okay, you have to take this way, you have to act this way, those questions, and please don't leave the certain way we recommend to you. And Max Weber, as other ones, took the chance of illness to develop his own questions and become a founding father somehow of understanding sociology in this special way. He was still publishing in journals or publishing in newspapers, but he wasn't academic anymore until shortly before his death. So I would recommend take some time off from academic business, and I think your institute is somehow like a place maybe where you have those abilities of not being overloaded with academic duties. Maybe, depends on Peter. But one lesson you could take from this here is that at certain moments it can be very fruitful if people have the chance to get out of things. But the point is they also have to have the ability to connect different disciplines. That's not easy. And since Max Weber had worked a lot in different things, he was able to connect. Because those connections are very difficult. So it sounds good, but it's very hard at the end to do some fruitful work then. Good. Yeah, and now I want to share some thoughts with you about this main work which was published shortly after his illness. I heard this morning that it's well known here in Serbia, The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, as a book which should motivate the people to become more Protestant. Yeah?
More German.
More German, yes. And I, as a German, can tell you, please don't become more German. No, I think it's very interesting to see that Max Weber was ambivalent about this Protestant ethics. He was somehow very proud of it. He liked it. But he also saw that this way of being very rational, very disciplined, confined his views on life. And his work, The Protestant Ethics, was the attempt to understand what is the dynamics behind it. Why are we like this? It was not a work to say this work should improve this Protestant ethics. It was a work to understand what is happening here. And another point was that he came from a very deep religious tradition of his mother's side. And this religious and Protestant tradition both were somehow, that was a part of his results, that the religious and Protestant tradition was somehow providing the inner dynamics of the Germans of the working habit in the capitalistic society. And maybe some of you have read the books or part of the book. So the core idea is that in the beginning, out of religious motives, people were working very consciously, very strictly. And as a result of this consciously working, gewissenhaftes Arbeiten in German, they made good business, had much money at the end. And in the beginning this was fine because they were still motivated by the religious world they were living in. But time by time, the money as such, in the beginning a side effect, was for the people much more attractive than in the beginning. And so the irrationality of the religious motive vanished away, and the irrationality of the financial motive, gaining more money, went into the center. I think we all know this dynamics. If we make some money and it's interesting, and money gains a certain dynamics over our inner motivation. And this was a core idea of this work in the history of ideas, to show how this paradox changing of the inner dynamics happened, and why the Protestant ethics was somehow one reason or one factor of capitalism. Not, it didn't explain everything, but it was clear for Weber, it was his interest to understand this factor, this reason, not everything. But it was clear for him that especially people who were raised in this tradition were able and somehow seduced to become great capitalists. And that this capitalism develops a dynamics which confines the people to the work, and which with the time changes the character of the people. And this is somehow the key question of Weber as a sociologist when he's talking about modern capitalism. What does capitalism make out of the people? This is his key question. What does this form of economics do with the people with the time? What are the people like after 100 years? And he was very critical on the people which were somehow used to work in this capitalism with the time. And there are very polemic sentences near to Nietzsche where he's talking about the last people, die letzten Menschen. Fachmenschen ohne Geist und Genussmenschen ohne Herz. Professionals without spirit and Genussmenschen, I don't know, people who like to enjoy things without a heart.
Hedonists.
Yeah. And he was very critical out on the result of this capitalistic world, and therefore you could say he's an indirect philosopher, taking care of thinking what happened to our people. And this was the same thing with the intellectual world. He knew, having read Nietzsche very often in his early years, that also the dynamics of intellectual work are somehow connected to the religious world in Nietzsche. Like this religious consciousness in the beginning was a great motive of exploring the world. And afterwards is somehow Nietzsche's idea, the people who were in the beginning motivated by the Christian belief to do the intellectual work, saw at the end that the belief which was originally motivating them was vanishing. That the outcome of the intellectual work was a secular world. This is the one thing, and that the rationality as such became the end and not something else. And therefore Weber was saying the most important intellectuals of the 19th century are Marx and Nietzsche, because the one was somehow showing the dynamics of the capital think and the other one of the intellectual think. And we as people of the 20th century, for whom enlightenment and rationality is very important, should recognize what happens if those dynamics have no certain end anymore and are taken as such. And you can have the whole Weber in those two questions: the economic and the intellectual development of the people, where the rationality as such is becoming an aim, an end. Yeah, I think now it's time to come to the talk of science as a vocation. As I said, it's a talk which Weber delivered at the end of his life, mostly in 1917, in November of 1917. And in Germany, it's still a very famous speech, like the other one, Politics as Vocation and Science as Vocation, are taken like the two classical speeches of Weber, where most of his ideas are condensed somehow. And we have now in Germany an edition of his works, about 25, 30 volumes, great work. But main thoughts are condensed in those two speeches, Science and Politics as a Vocation. And Weber was asked to deliver those speeches by students in Munich, liberal students, at the end of the war. So students not on the right, not on the left, liberal students. And the first speech, Science as a Vocation, is one which has two parts. The first part is on the outer vocation, the outer conditions of science. And he compares in this part the American and the German system. He had been to America in 1904 for some months. And this won't be the thing I will talk about today, but interesting is in this first part that Weber makes it very clear to his students that even the outer system in America, as in Germany, is a system of hazard. That means chance. And he's somehow disenchanting the students who think the academic world is a world of pure excellence. And Weber saying, no, the world of academia is a world of chance, of hazard. Not the bests are coming into positions. This is somehow he's so clear about these things, telling there are many good people and they might be able to wait, but they have to recognize that they might see during that time this or that bad guy passing by. And why? Because academia is like everything else an institution, a worldly thing, made by people, though the idea of excellence of science may be there, but since everything has to become an institution, it's like in every institution. There might be good people, but they're mostly or often people who are not the best ones gaining positions, because they know this or that guy, you know what I'm talking about. And this is so excellent to see that Weber is so critical about the institution of the university, saying it's not a center of excellence. There might be excellence in it, but there's often the case that people are in great positions and you start thinking, why? Aren't there better people? And the other point is with this, it's not just the critic on the institutional system of universities. It's like an example, this is how life functions. There's always chance and hazard in life. So in this first passage, you also see the philosopher Max Weber telling the people there's chance in life. There's not always justice. So you have somehow to adopt to it or think about it. So the life of the university is for him an example of how life works normally. And there might be good things on it, but there are often things which work very bad or not that well, and we somehow have to accustom to it and have to make up our minds how we want to live with it. And the point is, he doesn't want to say, please leave university, but be aware of it. And don't become desperate if you see it. So it's somehow like a teacher telling, this will be something you will experience in future times, and are you strong enough to take it? And all the students were saying, yes, we can take it. So it's like a rhetoric trick also, to telling how bad it will be, but maybe you are the one to overcome it and to be strong enough to stay in the system and not become desperate about it. But you can really see how Weber is discerning between the institution and the idea of the university, and how it depends on each person to follow the idea of the university, of the academic life, and to know that the idea and the reality are two things, and they are not always connected. But I know here they are connected. This is enough for the outer condition of the universities or the vocation. And now I come to the core point of the idea of the inner vocation. And Weber is saying, yes, this is what you want to know. What is the inner vocation in the society for science? And first he is telling the people, science nowadays is a specialized science. The fate of modern science is to be specialized. There's no chance of people becoming a specialist in everything. Everybody has to specialize on a certain field, to close up, to confine his view, to do something. And it's again a certain ambivalence in this sentence. On the one side, Weber is totally clear. As a young student, as a PhD student, you have to learn somehow to specialize, to confine to certain questions, to be correct, to argue clearly, to be consequent. So these are really virtues for doing science. But on the other side, Weber was totally clear that being a specialist is not enough if we want to clear up our questions of life. So this fate of science, which is totally specialized, needs people who trespass this fate, like him, because of his illness, but he doesn't talk about it. So somehow he's saying we have the fate of being specialized, and everybody somehow has to train in a specialized way, but then somehow there's a certain need still to ask the big questions in life. How we want to live, what gives meaning to life. And in the situation of 1917, when most of the students of the audience, mostly men at that time, came back from the war, they all were desperately asking for meaning, and science as the last institution of giving meaning. The state didn't have any authority anymore after the war, and also the churches. So the universities, the professors somehow were the people from whom one expected at least orientation and at least some meaningfulness. And Weber, this is the greatness about his speech, is accepting the question but disappointing the answer, saying we cannot give an answer to it. Every science who wants to give an answer to the question what is worthwhile in life would trespass their limited authority. And one can ask, why is it like this? And here comes the idea of Weber's idea what sciences are. Sciences are possibility of a rational argumentation, of showing certain technical consequences in things. But in every science, this is the conviction of Weber, there is a certain irrational standpoint connected to the person who is asking, a value standpoint, you could say, depending on the biography, on the social circumstances, on the personal decisions, what is meaningful for me. And this standpoint is very important for the direction of the research. And the main point is, this standpoint cannot be legitimized by science as such. So we have to decide to take the standpoint. And the only chance for the sciences, as Weber is saying, in a philosophical form of discussion of the standpoints, to clear up the personal standpoints. So what science could do is tell, okay, we have this idea, how things could happen, And behind this idea, there's this or that moral or other standpoint or interest. So science has a certain function of clearing up, but clearing up is everything they can do and not legitimizing the standpoint. So he discerns between clearing up a thing, the standpoint, a certain or different standpoints, and the need of finding an authority for the standpoint. And he's saying, no, science is not giving us the authority to take this or that standpoint. This is due to us. We have to decide. And therefore many researchers and scientists since then are saying Max Weber is a Decisionist, we say in German. He is drawn to decision making, and this is just irrational. There's no rationality in Weber anymore, and we could go much further than he did in making rational decisions. So this is an open question, how far the irrationality of Weber is going, and whether it would still be possible to have rational arguments for a certain standpoint or not. And many people who don't like Weber are saying he's closing up way too early. Science is much more capable and able to find rational standpoints for certain decisions in our lives. And this question is open, and it might be that Weber drew the line too early. But what is important about his work, and also in Science as a Vocation, to show the problem that science as such has a limited objectivity, and that there are always subjective points in it, in the social and cultural sciences, and that we need to clarify our standpoints and not hide behind rational argumentations. So doing science means at a certain point to be aware of our own persons. What is my standpoint? Where do I come from? What do I want? And to stand for it. And not just say, yes, I'm an exponent of this or that science. There's always something personal in it. And you all know how difficult it is to have a personal standpoint in the public. So the question is somehow how to demonstrate our point in the public, how to lead such a discussion about standpoints in the public, where the own person is somehow asked. And therefore this very easy and simple thought of Weber, which is not very intellectually high, is still so important. So it's not the problem of understanding this point, it's very easy. But not easy is to live and to somehow come to your own standpoint and to challenge other standpoints in an open discussion without hiding behind scientific explanations. This is something very typical, yeah? We can use. Good. I come to the next point of this speech, which is typical not just for Weber but for the time. He, as many intellectuals of those days, referred to Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy, you could see in around 1900, was one of the leading European intellectuals for metaphysical questions. And reading Weber, you can see that he was somehow attached to this way of asking metaphysical questions, of asking why life could be still worthwhile while we are dying. So the question of death, which was raised by Heidegger in Sein und Zeit, is raised some years earlier by Tolstoy in a very deep way and taken by Weber and other ones, that the time of enlightenment and progression is great. So it's wonderful to live in a time of enlightenment and progression, Fortschritt. But all those things, enlightenment, progression, do not solve the problem of dying sometime, and don't give an answer what happens then. So in old days, for the intellectuals, where the people were living in a closed world with clear worldviews, a religious belief, another one, dying was somehow part of life. and legitimized by a certain religion or other worldview. But for the intellectual in the modern times, the problem of dying is something new, because we can have progress and we can live for progress and enlightenment, but some certain time we all will die. And then we have to ask ourselves, is it enough that we have a life for progress, that we enlighten ourselves and other ones? So what is the meaning of our life when it comes to die? And Weber is asking this question in Science as a Vocation and stressing very clearly that science will not help at that moment. And he's saying, yes, some people might go back to the churches, some people might take this or that standpoint by a certain authority given, but at the end we all have to decide, and science cannot help us. So he stresses in a certain way the need to make up your own thoughts about this standpoint or this question in a philosophical way. And no science could help. And another thing he's telling, and which is somehow fitting to this, is that he's clearly saying we as people of the modern world, as enlightened people, we don't have the idea that there are eternal ideas anymore. He quotes at a certain passage of the speech the famous myth of the cage, Plato's myth of the cage, saying there was the idea of eternal ideas before, and there are still some people in our times who develop this idea in new forms of eternal possibilities, but we as scientists can only take ideas as pragmatic tools and terms to understand certain things, and who are changing with the time. So we all have ideas with which we live, which we use for our science and our lives, but all ideas have somehow just a pragmatic use and are depending on historical change. So in this passage you could somehow see the worldview of Weber in the background. So you could say Max Weber is a radical historicist, not believing in eternal things anymore, but believing that our standpoint is only a pragmatic one, a changing one, and depending on historical situations. And that there's no access to eternal ideas anymore, that there's no privilege to an eternal world. And if you think in comparison of thinkers like Leo Strauss, for example, he still had the idea there are philosophers, an esoteric group, which is capable of those ideas. And those ideas somehow are still living, but there are just some people who know about them. And those people should be leaders for the other ones. Or if you think of the German circle about Stefan Georg, the literary circle in the Heidelberg of Max Weber's, they were sure that there are some people who are belonging to this esoteric circle of still cultivating eternal ideas. Or there are people in the political sphere having the idea of having somehow eternal ideas and being the leaders of other ones. And Weber, in this way, is limiting his own and the ability of others of having ideas to a pragmatic standpoint. And that there's no privilege anymore of some eternal ideas. And this is, for me, the core of his speech and the core of his own philosophy. And his idea of plurality. Because if you are following him, it's not easy to live anymore. There is a plurality of standpoints. There might be a hierarchy of standpoints, but it has to be discussed. And there's no clearness what is the most important standpoint. What is the privileged standpoint? And even the persons, even Max Weber himself, as I was saying, he was an intellectual who had the idea that there should be a meaningful whole, knowing that all I'm saying and all I'm thinking is just the limited standpoint of my time, could feel a certain ambivalence about it, insecurity. So it's a great difference of someone who feels that his standpoint is limited, but still knows in the background of his mind of the lost possibility of something else. And therefore he's not a nihilist or something, but someone who feels the tension of our modern times very clearly, because there's still in the background the idealistic possibility and chance of finding something, a great philosophical idea. So in Weber, this tension between the lost idealistic standpoint and the pragmatic standpoint of modernity is very vivid and goes through all lines of his writings. And therefore, Weber has to be taken as a philosophical writer. Because, well, I repeat myself too often, you know what I mean. Okay. I'm almost done with this. One point I touched already, the connection or the core topic of sciences and value judgments. This was very important in the 1960s when Weber was discussed by Karl Popper, Adorno, and other ones, and some understood him wrongly as a positivist. It's totally wrong. Max Weber wasn't a positivist at all. So it's very important to see that his apology of sciences and value judgments didn't mean that sciences can be without values or can be positivistic sciences, but his point was that all values which we find in a scientific standpoint have to be cleared up and cannot be legitimated by science as such. This is a difference. But there's no science without any standpoint or value judgment in it. But the judgment as such is not part of the science. So therefore, it's clear that in all scientific approaches there's a certain irrational core, something we cannot define by science anymore, in all cultural and social sciences. And this irrational core is somehow the core of Weber's idea. How can we cope with it? And in certain essays of his, he's saying, yes, we have to decide sometime what we want to stand for. And his anthropological approach is that man, as such, who's behaving in life, or scientist who's doing science, has to decide at a certain point what he wants to stand for. And the thing he wants to stand for cannot be rationally legitimized. So somehow it's irrational. And this irrational point belongs to human beings. And in former times it was somehow legitimized by church or by the nations or other authorities. But in our times, for the intellectuals, it's clear that there's nobody else except of myself to decide. I have no authority in the background anymore. So the modern autonomy of a person is a very hard business, not easy. Freedom as such is very hard for Weber, because it's connected to the ambivalence of being insecure whether my decision is right or wrong, and whether I can live with it or not. What did I write? Was this morning? I think I'm done with it. And when you ask how can we come to those decisions, Weber is very clear that nobody can decide for himself totally. We are all connected to other people, we are connected to groups. So it's somehow a need to discuss, to find people with whom we can share our thoughts, our ideas, our decisions. nobody can decide just for himself. Nobody will just decide for himself. He's always connected to other people. He's influenced by other people, whether one wants it or not. So Weber is showing that in former times, until just recently, he calls it monumentale Kulturen, monumental cultures next to Nietzsche. Cultures which were based in the whole society. Values which are based in the whole society. And this is important only for the intellectuals. Those values are not possible anymore. The intellectuals are those peoples who are not believing in those monumental cultures anymore. Not the religious cultures, not the national cultures, not the great political cultures. So the people who feel as the inner need of being intellectual, who are self-critical, somehow know that those times of a monumental culture are over, that the society as such is not giving us helps to decide for ourselves. And out of his own life experience, he was saying the only chance those intellectuals have is to cultivate, he says, intimate cultures, intime Kulturen. This means small groups in which people meet, like the circle he was living in with certain people, like friendships. And he said, this is a possibility where the pneuma, the spirit of former times, may live again for those people, may. So what people could do, intellectuals, if they don't believe in the big monumental cultures anymore, might search for people with whom they can build up intimate cultures and share thoughts and decisions. This is at the end of his speech to the students in Munich, his advice. Try to find people with whom you can share those ideas and interests. But it would be too easy to close up with this thought. And before that, Weber is clearly saying, even if you find people, you will be aware or become aware of a great problem. That the decisions you might draw in yourself are departed. Because you have different interests. If you build up intimate cultures with other people, it doesn't mean you come to one solution. In your own personality, you have a plurality of viewpoints. And he talks about the renaissance of the antique polytheism. Polytheism in the sense of plurality in your own person. And at that point he becomes very dramatically, or he speaks very dramatically, because this plurality in the persons of being aware of different values in your own personality means that those values are struggling with each other. And even you in your own person will not be able to harmonize the struggle. So there might be things which struggle in ourselves. We might be in a great group of people, but still I'm not sure what is the right value to follow. Is there one? Or is there always the struggle between different standpoints which are important for myself? And one advice he's giving those students is that science won't solve the problem of those different value standpoints. There might be, at the end, he's saying, a personal demon who is solving the problem, but it's very clear that the metaphor of a demon is not a good salvation. It's something very demonic too, something irrational, something one cannot understand. So Weber, and this gives somehow the tension to the text, is knowing I as a person am very difficult. And I'm ambivalent about my own person. I cannot lean on me in terms of being one-minded, yeah? I may be inconsequent and do different things at different times, and all things still belong to me. And I have no real idea who I am. And in former times he was saying, in the Christian times, I at least knew how to connect those different things, to give them a framework, to know what was good and bad. But now even this is not possible. So he's a real modern personality, which is saying we have no chance as intellectuals to be aware of this plurality, even our personalities, but we have good reason to be ambivalent about it. Not to say it's great, but to see it's a real difficult task to somehow come into terms with it and to live with it. Good, this is enough of Weber, and at the end of my talk, I hope, yes, give me 10 minutes or 5 minutes and then we'll come to the end. I want to say or show at the example of Jaspers and Lukács how people could react to this idea of ambivalence. This is very interesting to see that Weber had many peoples around him and different peoples from different branches who developed totally differently. And one of the early young scholars around him were Georg Lukács, who's well known in the East, and Karl Jaspers, who's well known in the West. And both are young scholars, and I will tell just a little story how both try to react to the idea of plurality and ambivalence in Weber, to show that people are seduced to find clear solutions to a problem, different solutions, but to find clear solutions in order to come into terms with their own personalities. And I will start with Georg Lukács. Many of you know he came from Budapest, and he wrote in the beginnings of about 1910, 11, a small book, The Theory of the Novel. It's a very subjective book where the European literature is taken as a possibility of thinking about the whole, the meaningful whole again. And a possibility of coming into terms with what he calls the transcendental homelessness. So in the beginning, Georg Lukács in the circle around Max Weber was a person who was developing his subjectivity, his questions for meaning very strongly. And he stayed in Heidelberg, and the war broke out, and Karl Jaspers, at that time still a psychiatrist in Heidelberg, was writing for him an attest that he's a very nervous personality and very vulnerable, and it's not good that he should go to war. So Lukács stayed there in Heidelberg, went back to Budapest afterwards, but then had a certain, one could say, event of coming to a new belief. In 1917, 1918, he was in Russia and observed the Russian Revolution with his new wife, and he was so convinced that this was his way now, that he at last found the possibility of connecting his thoughts to a meaningful whole. And he left his subjectivity behind him, saying this subjectivity is just a thing which is irritating for the people. And we all have to come to a common ground, to a common idea of a just world which is connected meaningfully. And I, as an intellectual, have the task to develop thoughts how this development could go further. And in this task he felt at home. So you could say Georg Lukács somehow lost the illness of his subjectivity, coming to the idea of the Russian Revolution and building up his own theory of how things could develop. And his whole writing since then is somehow led and inspired by this idea there is a possibility of an objective truth. And I, as an intellectual, have the task for the other ones to write about this truth and to lead them on this path that they will recognize how they could live and why it's worthwhile to share this truth. And on the other side, Karl Jaspers, he never turned to this world. He even started to explain and explore the subjective world. He wrote first his works on Van Gogh, Strindberg, Hölderlin on ill artists and their subjectivity, and then developed a certain form of philosophy with orientation of the world, enlightenment of the existence, and metaphysics, where this subjectivity was somehow developed in a certain way of an existence philosophy of existence. And both lost contact, developed in totally different directions after Weber's death, but met again in 1946 in Geneva, when there was a European Congress of intellectuals asking, what is the future of Europe? And both are somehow struggling. Lukács was giving his viewpoint of this possibility of objective truth, and Jaspers was giving his standpoint of a form of subjective truth, saying what Lukács is saying is totally wrong as an illusion of objectivity. But for me, and this is interesting, whether both were somehow consequent in their ways of finding certain ways to overcome the ambivalence of plurality, their solutions show in a certain way that you can be successful, and then you can build up a whole philosophy on it, but that you lose on the way the insight into the ambivalence of plurality and the necessity, and this is somehow the Weberian standpoint, to keep the questions open. Thank you.